Europe Part 2, and boy is there a lot to talk about humans in Europe. It's pretty exciting stuff. Like I said, the center of the world for so many years, the influence of what Europe has done to the world throughout colonization, throughout being the epicenter of our world wars, to what it's become today is just a lot to talk about. We could have a whole class on just Europe, so obviously I encourage you to do more investigation yourself within the book or with other resources that I could provide to you. But here's going to be our brief overcap of Europe from a human dimension, and start with human patterns over time. First, the impact of communism. So Karl Marx was a philosopher, and he developed a reading called the Communist Manifesto in 1848. That eventually led to the idea of Marxism and communism as we know it today. Again, oversimplifying some of this a bit, but for the sake of time and for the sake of simplicity, we would just leave it at that, in the sense that we remember communism is an alternative to capitalism, where it's the redistribution of wealth in a more equitable way. Again, simplifying it. I'm not sure if Marx would be pleased by that. Just brief synopsis, but again, this transformed Europe in a variety of ways, mostly to the east. This eventually led in 1917 to the takedown of the Tsars of Russia, and it became the USSR as we know it, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And it's demonstrated here by all these states. You have the Baltic states, we have part of Eastern Europe, Russia, the Caucasus states, and the Central Asian states, republics. And so this scope of the USSR, the former USSR, is the entirety of Chapter 5. So we'd leave it at that in this extent for now, for our purposes of Europe. But the idea of communism and Marxism still exists today. However, the way communism moved in Europe in terms of westward from Russia is in the idea that there was the formation of political parties, communist, Marxist political parties that operated peacefully within democratic societies, unlike what we saw in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and what we've seen in that of the communist states. And so the impact of communism was grander and more pronounced in the USSR, of course, because it's one of its foundations, but it did have its impact in the rest of Europe as well through political parties. And you do see that strong safety net exist throughout parts of Europe. Now, World War I. Again, we could have a whole class on World War I, and it's exciting stuff. It's actually profoundly devastating to have to think about World War I, World War II, and later on we'll talk more about wars in Europe. But it's important to know, as those of you who probably had a history class before or some sort of class on world history would know about this, but I mention it because it shapes Europe in a profound way, the world wars, and so we have to mention it a bit, because in order to know our questions of why, we have to sort of know some of these preceding questions. So 1914, 1918, World War I took place. Again, to oversimplify, Austrian Franz Ferdinand goes to Serbia, the parts of what would now be Yugoslavia, as you can see what came away afterwards. He's assassinated. This idea now has become viewed as what was a 9/11 effect, which is historical reference to our 9/11, a terrorist attack that reshapes the political landscape and has profound consequences. And so we can imagine that we still understand 9/11 for its profound impact on the lives of Americans and around the world. And so we can think of that sort of incident as a catalyst for starting World War I. It was bound by the Central Powers versus the Allied powers around the world. And what we see here, I think, which is most notable to think about, why we talk about World War I, is its profound loss of life. We have millions and millions and millions of people that have died in World War I, and it's left places left in devastation, of course, because of the impacts of war. It was one of the first modern wars around the world. We have new things like tanks, airplanes, machine guns, trench warfare, which led to tons of diseases in the trenches, digging tunnels, but they're not closed, so it wouldn't be a tunnel, I guess. but an open tunnel, if that makes any sense. Would be a trench, barbed wire and things that would be barricaded in between these places that they would refer to as no man's land. Quite interesting, but one of the first modern wars, and again, millions of people dead because of some of these modern innovations. But I mentioned it because of the fall of empires. It reconfigured the entire map of Europe, where we see the Russian Empire withdraws some of its claim. Finland is created. The Baltic states are created. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We see Poland comes to play. Austria-Hungary breaks up into Czechoslovakia and Austria and Hungary separately. And we see Yugoslavia born. The Ottoman Empire rolls back. And we have Turkey. And so the map profoundly changes. It has long-term effects. We have the League of Nations that's set up, the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations. And this is the League of Nations was created in sort of an intergovernmental organization, international government organization, in the sense that countries are members, they belong, and they try to prevent war from happening again. You could say that this failed pretty quickly because it brings us to World War II. Now again, World War I, recap, because it was very simple, it was very quick. 1914 to 1918, this isn't that long ago. We're sitting at about a 100-year anniversary, well, the 100-year anniversary at the end of World War I. We have the sort of the reason why it began, one of the catalysts, among others, fall of empires and the reconfiguration of the entire map of Europe, which shortly thereafter leads us to World War II. How can you imagine something to be more devastating than World War I? Bit of a tongue twister. World War I, when you have millions of people killed, the war to end all wars certainly did not. World War II happens, 1939 to 1945. Again, a lot to say about this. We could have a whole class on it, and that would be exciting. It was sad and exciting, but very interesting. I think everyone would agree on interesting. But basically what it boils down to is Germany still a bit sad, bummed out that in fact they had to pay in a large way for World War I. Their pride is hurt. Again, these countries are homogenous in the sense that the French are of France, the Italians of Italy, so we have these nation states, more homogenous groups, and so nationalism is important. Now you do see communism, Marxism existing in Europe, and you have this existence, this immersion of fascism come to play in Western Europe, and that of Germany. We know that Adolf Hitler, famous politician, famous for nothing good, and he comes and rises to power in the 1930s in Germany, and he has this promotion that the Germans will rise again to be an even bigger, better, stronger nation and empire. And this idea of Germany first, make Germany great again, type of rhetoric, and that's exactly what happens. And because of the dire financial straits, unemployment, and all the other things that were weighing in on Germany at the time, people bought in, people bought it up. Hard times were happening. Perhaps you could say it's somewhat similar to some of the rhetoric that was happening in the United States in terms of the global recession, but I don't want to draw too many similarities to that because that would be very unfortunate and dangerous. However, I don't think we're too far away in the type of rhetoric that's being used here in the United States in terms of American first policies, and all others are somewhat inferior, which is somewhat where we're getting at. And I bring that up because the consequences, words matter, actions matter, and you can see this, we're not so far away. We have living survivors of World War II walking among us, and they can tell us the horrors of this. But again, back to where we were, sort of got a little off topic, but back to where we were. And so Germany decides to expand its reach, its power. It finds Benito Mussolini, his crazy fascist friend in Italy, and they partner up, and he eventually partners with the Emperor of Japan, and you have the Axis powers, the bad guys, until we get into then most of the rest of the world, in the sense of the Allies, the United States and France, Britain, Russia, and these countries that save the world, if you will, the ones that combat this Axis powers. You have some neutral actors, and some were more neutral than others. You have Spain with its a little bit of lean with Francisco Franco, maybe his sympathy, if you will, for the Axis powers to some extent. Ireland helped a little bit the Allied powers. So again, these are neutral states, neutral to only some extent. Major wars happening, major battles happening within this war. Dunkirk among them. New movie out that you can check out and see the evacuation out. The D-Day, 1944. That's happening there, a big landing that took place, and there's many others. We're not going to get into discussing every battle, but back to things again, sort of working our way back. Adolf Hitler decides to expand his reach, to scoff up this territory, to become this German empire. Countries fell relatively quickly. They weren't exactly too prepared for this type of attack. It began with Blitzkrieg, which was the quick, lightning-fast invasion of Poland, which forced Great Britain to tip its hand and finally declare war. And the rest, most of the rest of Europe had fallen relatively quickly. Great Britain exists the way it does because it's an island. Again, the Holocaust would be something to mention, that you have to mention when you're talking about World War II. Millions of people exterminated, an ethnic cleansing or genocide simply because of who they were. They targeted a variety of people. It seemed like Jews, obviously, people of Jewish faith were targeted, but they also targeted Romas, some Catholics, some ethnic Poles, some Soviet POWs, just a variety of people, the disabled, homosexuals. I mean, just just random people sometimes, I'm sure, got caught up in it. And so, again, this wasn't something that was just sort of one group of people. Obviously, they were persecuted to another level of tragedy, but a lot of different minority groups were in fact killed, and then millions and millions of casualties at the civilian level and at the level in the military, and we are talking in the tens of millions. And so a profound impact on the continent of Europe. Again, borders are redrawn again in certain parts, and it leads us to the Warsaw Pact, which comes kind of in the Cold War, which is the post-World War II era until the 1990s, and I have a slide coming up on that. But what I'll say about the Warsaw Pact is it divides Western Europe and the creation of NATO and free Western Europe, and then you find the Warsaw Pact, which is Eastern Europe, which is now Central Europe, and places like Czechoslovakia and Poland, and stuff. Warsaw Pact, Warsaw, Poland, of course, and the USSR, and you see that Soviet sphere of influence over Central and Eastern Europe, as well as out east into Russia, and you see that sort of great divide, which does lead us into the Cold War, 1945, 1991. We talked about this before, so this shouldn't be new information. You should be thinking, oh, I've heard about this before. I think I've mentioned it in at least 2 of my slides before, the idea of capitalism versus communism. And you can see this divide, this iron curtain that comes down, the Warsaw Pact, or the Eastern Bloc, there in red, and the NATO, Western Europe countries there to the west. Eventually, there's the fall of the Soviet Union in '91. You see these countries become free of Soviet control and become independent countries. They're in the Eastern Bloc. It's a trickle effect. And then we'll talk more about that in a moment, about sort of what were some of the catalysts of change there. Pretty interesting things, I think. The Marshall Plan was just U.S. financing of restoring Europe to some of its prosperity. $140 billion in today's dollars over the course of a few years, funneling money into Western Europe to repair its infrastructure, industry, and things like that to sort of restore it. So that was sort of a U.S. aid plan to that of Western Europe from World War II. The European Union. I've already talked about the EU, the European Union. So hope you were following along in that sense. You probably heard about it before. It's 28 countries in Europe. You could see there in this design, 28 and pending, you know, here illustrated. The United Kingdom, of course, makes that infamous Brexit vote to leave the European Union. It's in the works. We're still a European Union member. I'll probably talk about that later. I'll probably forget that I mentioned it here when I didn't plan to, but you know, here it comes. So there's going to be a few countries that aren't European, obviously European Union members that are in Europe. Switzerland, a notable example, a neutral country. Iceland, absent. Norway, absent. And then part of historically what was Yugoslavia or the Balkan states. They're, again, candidates, but not quite in the European Union yet. Now, to go back a little bit historically, the importance of steel and coal in 1951 was the first step in creating the European Union. It created the Economic Community of Europe, the EEC, which formed in 58, with 6 original members, and then it eventually broke away decades later to be the EU, the European Union, in 1992, and slowly has built up membership. Again, it started with just a handful of countries, and every couple years, more and more would join. Globalization and development. Economic integration is kind of important in Europe to try to remove the disparities between member states of the European Union. So that shift of industry and manufacturing around the European Union comes with the service industry that's taking place in Europe and around the world. We saw that in the United States. The importance of the service industry, knowledge-based economies. 40% of the service industry are now these knowledge-intensive jobs happening in Europe. So 70% of the European Union jobs, or European jobs, are in the service industry. And this EU policy is called the cohesion policy, and you can see demonstrated here through this classification of regions, are where money is being allocated around the European Union to create a more holistic or equal playing field. And you can see spenders or countries that are more to be known to be more well off. That would have been places like the United Kingdom, parts of France, of course, Germany, Netherlands, more the Western Europe, North Europe countries were really subsidizing places like Greece, Southern Italy, parts of Spain and Portugal, and obviously Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland and formerly Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, happened in 1993, but not important at the moment. We'll talk about that later. But again, you can see that area devastatingly in red. Of course, red is a negative number in this area because it's less developed. And you can see that in this area, it's a point of contention. Countries get frustrated that they have to be putting money in and it's not being sent to their own local areas, it's being sent elsewhere. But it's for the greater good. This idea for the greater good is important in Europe. And it establishes an equal playing field that would advance the mission and goals of that of the entire European Union. And so that's a theme that's relatively important to keep in mind here. Tourism is relatively important in Europe. 1 in 8 jobs in the EU are because of tourism. France, Spain, and Italy lead Europe in annual visitors, tens of millions of visitors per country a year. And so it's important to know that tourism is a component of their that service industry, and it's an important part of their economy. Obviously not the number one aspect of their economy, which does still sit in other sectors, but this is sort of birthed from the Schengen Agreement, implemented in 95, created in 85, and it allows for the free movement between European Union countries. Sort of like you would see if you would be taking a road trip in the United States and you're driving down the road and it doesn't take you too far to get to Georgia from here, but you're driving and, you know, when you go cross into Georgia, you're not stopped and checked and your car is taken apart and things like what would happen at the border between the United States and Mexico or the United States and Canada. And so that free movement between countries sort of operates how we would operate within our 48 contiguous states here in the United States. And so you can imagine that facilitated tourism within European countries themselves, Europeans going from country to country in terms of tourism, but more importantly, for the exchange of goods and services to be creating an integrated land area. Because again, these countries are quite small in a lot of ways. And so to only have to operate within that specific country in terms of imports and exports, to be able to create a larger area does allow for a greater marketplace. And it does in fact have a lot of economic ramifications behind the Schengen Agreement. And we'll talk about it more for what it means for immigration and the future of the Schengen Agreement. Currently, the euro is the currency for the European Union in almost all circumstances. There are a few countries that don't use the euro and are part of the European Union, but they're definitely an outlier. Day ago or so, I looked it up to see where it was because the exchange does obviously fluctuate. It changed 10 cents from the last time that I looked, but currently about $1.25 of US dollar to 1 euro. So you can see the euro is a bit stronger than the US dollar in today's standard. Now, food and farming in Europe is important because when you think about Europe, you might think about the major cities, but you also might think of the rural farmlands and sort of that history between from what Europe would be imagined it to be in terms of things like here. There's a picture of a field, some sheep grazing here in part of eastern Slovakia. I got to take about a decade ago. But again, food security has been a concern in Europe for decades, leading to large subsidies in the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, overwhelming part of the European Union's budget had to go for subsidizing farming and agriculture in the European Union. That led to the Common Agricultural Program, the CAP program, an EU policy that exists today. It's to guarantee safe food at an affordable price in Europe and to be fair incomes for farmers. It was drastically revised in 2013 because it was still taking quite a lot of money. And there's some drawbacks. There's an entire debate around CAP policy because everything's debated. But I talk about it because it actually, in some situations, drove up the price of food, or it led to times of overproduction. Because of the subsidies, it led to an overproduction of agricultural products. That then was called dumping, where they would then throw that to the rest of the global market, and then it would actually harm small farms in the third world or the developing world, former colonies perhaps, and places like that, because their product from Europe was so cheap it actually hurt other countries. Because this idea of tariffs and things that are in place in Europe for its agriculture, it does not allow other countries to compete from an agricultural standpoint, unless it's obviously something that they can't produce for themselves and they have to import it. Europe isn't exactly known for its banana production or something like that, of course. And so the CAP policy has had positive and negative effects in both Europe and around the world, and which is why it was drastically revised in 2013 and continues to be investigated. Power and politics, of course, important in Europe because of that extreme power that the European continent has had for hundreds of years. Obviously, just like North America and the United States, those BRICS countries are elevating themselves, their statuses around the world to rival the collective powers of the United States in places like Europe. We're talking about 750 million people, give or take, the European continent, and so it's important to discuss their power and politics and influence around the world. EU expansion. And we talk about the expansion of the EU because that's where the book really spends most of its time discussing the power of Europe, because the power of Europe expands as the EU expands and its sphere of influence expands. And when it moves, it's moving in an eastern direction. Of course, Western Europe was the heart of the EU in its earliest times, in the 1950s, when it started as a union for coal and steel. Hopefully you remember that because I just said it a few moments ago. In 1950s, 1958, of course, 6 countries. In 1992, it becomes the European Union, and it slowly starts to build countries. Like I mentioned, they slowly acquire more and more countries. You have to be a candidate. There's a process that's involved. You have to have a free and fair democratic elections. You have to have special human rights standards. You have to have economic policies that favor that of the European Union in terms of its economic fairness. And you have to be a stand-up country to get into the European Union. They're not letting everybody get in. So this process is deliberate, and it's a diligent process as well. So it continues to expand. We're sort of running out of countries that it will expand to within Europe, but there are still a few candidate countries. So we sort of work backwards in the history of the European Union expansion. So who the heck is Lech Walesa? And he is a Pole. He's featured there in Time magazine, Poland's Lech Walesa, and he was very instrumental in the Gdansk Agreement. Gdansk is a Polish port city. He worked there in the late 1970s, very influential for the 21 demands, and this is some Polish here for you, the MKS, or we could talk about it as the Miejsce Zakładowe Komitet Strajkowy, and that is the Polish MKS, and it is stands for the Interfactory Strike Committee. And maybe you can sort of get at the root of that, by all means, if you speak Polish, but you could probably deduct that if I learned how to pronounce that for this presentation, it's probably going to be on the exam, or else it would all have been just in vain, and what for that. So remember that, because this was a catalyst for some European expansion into, European Union expansion into the East, because what happened here was a pushback on communism, and when these unions gained extra rights, and they gained, when the unions actually gained formation to be a union, what you had were strikes of workers in certain areas that were under the communist bloc, and they wanted rights, and they wanted fairer deals, and they wanted fairer conditions. They had demands that were in place, and it led to the Gdansk Agreement, orchestrated by Lech Walesa, who eventually became Poland's second president, 1990 to 1995. Shortly after this takes place, he formed the Solidarity Party, which you can see illustrated there through these demonstrations. And what it did was it struck a little a chip or a little crack in the glass ceiling of the influence of communism and the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. That led to Glasnost, which is 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, was an increase in transparency in USSR, Soviet Union, Russian relations and their interworkings within their government operations. And it eventually became to the point of so long Soviets, hello EU, and what you saw was from that Warsaw Pact a rollback, and countries decided to start looking west to Western Europe, of course, and democracy and free market economy from the east. And so you saw this EU expand in an eastward fashion. Then, who's next to join? The book talks about Turkey. Now, Turkey, of course, has gone through some changes even since this book that was published quite recently is even seen. So Erdogan is the leader, the head of state in Turkey. He's kind of a bad hombre. He commits a lot of human rights violations. He exactly wasn't, he became a bit more of an autocratic ruler since the Arab Spring in 2011 in the Middle East. He certainly hasn't been a friendly face in a lot of international conflict and relations. And so he is not going to be helping Turkey's case gain access to the European Union. And in fact, it was ruled not that long ago that because of the current circumstances, i.e. the leader that's there, they're not going to be getting access to the European Union despite being a candidate. So that's not happening. Eastward expansion, question mark. Well, it's something to think about. The Caucasus states were something to think about. They obviously have some issues that we'll talk more about when we talk about them in Chapter 5. South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria from Moldova, and we'll talk about those sort of issues. You probably have no idea what that meant. You hear those terms, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in Chapter 5. Some very interesting international, regional conflicts that are happening there that will prevent them from joining the European Union. Obviously, the Ukraine, there's a crisis right now in the Ukraine. From a couple years ago, it's still happening. Western media sort of lost interest in it, but it's still happening there. It's obviously a drawback of why they're not entering. And you have countries that simply don't want to enter, like Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and countries like that. So probably an eastward expansion, if anywhere. There's former Yugoslavian states in the Balkan Peninsula will be their candidates, and they'll gain access once they clean up their resume a bit. So we have the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, between some European countries, Turkey, Canada, and the United States. And again, that formed in relation to the Warsaw Pact, Cold War time. It was It became a mission of peacekeeping, largely from the early 2000s when the United States decided to get involved in the Middle East, in our conflicts. And so NATO, based there in Europe, with the EU also based in Europe, based there in Brussels, Belgium, sort of the de facto capital of Europe, as I may have mentioned before. And so it's important, very powerful organization based there in Western Europe. Let's do some current leaders, put some faces to some names. You've probably heard these discussed at some varying length. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, she's been serving since 2005, one of the longer serving world leaders at this point, especially in a democracy. She's regarded as the leader of the European Union, the leader of Europe, Europe's largest economy, largest in terms of population too. And she's even, since the election of Donald Trump in the United States, she's even been regarded as leader of the free world. And so she's quite a powerful figure. The Christian Democratic Union and political party in Germany, it's a center political party. And she's been serving for over a decade. She's in her 4th term as chancellor. She's forming a coalition government that's still trying to take form today from her most recent election over the last year. Emmanuel Macron, he is from France. He's been serving since 2017, very recently elected. You saw that there was a very contentious election that was taking place in France last year. Perhaps you're following it. His opponent, she in fact was coming from a bit more of a nationalistic standpoint. Her politics were a bit edgier, a little bit more of a France first kind of ideology, and quite conservative. Emmanuel Macron wins the election and takes over as president of France after Francois Hollande, socialist, resigns. He again, En Marche, his political party is also center, in center politically speaking, left and right and center of these politicians. Then we have Theresa May, a geographer, actually, fun fact for me. And so she's a geographer. She's serving as, we had resignation from from the United Kingdom. Theresa May takes over from 2016 in the wake of Brexit and a lot of the complicated things that's happening right now in the United Kingdom. She's trying to navigate the way. There's 2 main political parties, if you will, in the United Kingdom, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, Labour being more left-leaning, Conservative being our right-leaning. If we draw comparisons to the United States, she is from the Conservative Party, and she's been serving since 2016. So you see some newcomers here to the table. We had a resignation happen in the last few years in Italy. We see a new some new leadership there, and we obviously see new leadership happening in Ireland. Leo Varadkar is the new leader of the Taoiseach in Ireland, and some other new actors throughout Europe, but they're to a lesser extent less influential. To a large extent, these 3 have the largest say in European Union politics and European politics at large. Urbanization in Europe is quite a fascinating topic because it is quite urban and quite densely populated. So the history of European cities as trading centers does facilitate that idea that Europe is in fact a greater concentrated because of the old city centers. And so because of the historic nature of the construction of European cities, it facilitates for denser populations, and that facilitates good urban transportation, public transportation, and interconnectedness. And so, you can see, you sometimes picture some of the older sites of Europe, but there are quite new innovations and new infrastructure that's taking place. But something that's, since World War II, European cities expanded at the outward, from the city centers outward into what we would consider suburbs or the periphery of cities, but not like that we saw in the United States with our white picket fences and our large yards and things like that. There's still this level of connectedness that's just not experienced in that of North America. You still have great urban public transportation to connect these urban centers to each other. The lack of the reliance on the car. These are areas that are walkable, bikeable, and definitely can take public transportation to keep these cities quite integrated together, which does in fact reduce carbon emissions when it's a much less intense process of keeping one connected with one another from a living standpoint, living, working, recreating type of situation. Population and gender and socio-cultural issues move pretty quickly in Europe. You can see that the population's aging. The book spends a long time discussing this. It can be boiled down to be quite quick. 15 years or younger. Over the last few decades, we saw this number go from 27% to 16% in Europe. You can see 26% is the world average. So they were about the world average. They're down to less than 10% of that now. And so what you see is a smaller, younger population happening in Europe, just because there's not a lot of people being born there. In a second, we'll talk more about that. Now, 65 years and older, another vulnerable population or a dependent population. It was at 9% and it's up to 17%. 8% was the world average, so we're up to 9% more than that. And so it's nearly doubled over the last few decades. And so what you've seen is less younger people, more older people, hence an aging population coming in Europe. And that's happening for that is because, again, it's a westernized society, one that has a lot of equal access for women into the workforce and education. And so what we've experienced in Europe is in fact a society that has had more progress for women in comparison to the rest of the world. And so more women enter the workforce and entering education, less babies being born, so that rate of natural increase is close to negative here in Europe, and the total fertility rate is less than the replacement values. And so what can we do about that? Maybe nothing if we don't have to do anything about it. But if Europe wants to continue to expand, or at least stay status quo population-wise, some things will need to happen. Fertility rates will need to increase, which is unlikely to happen naturally. However, due to the proliferation of immigrants taking hold in Europe, you will see more people being born, but they won't be native-born Europeans. There'll be folks coming from other parts of the world, and usually what you'll see in a generation or two, they too will integrate into European society and sort of take on those same types of family sizes. Life expectancy is high in Europe, the highest region in the world in high numbers, so among the oldest people in the world, and that's because of strong healthcare systems, diet, walking, friendly life, a whole variety of factors. And that's why you see those population pyramids skew. They're kind of heavy on the top because people are not having a lot being born. But again, you have quite a few living into their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 100 years old. Active aging is an EU policy that's on 3 principles: to keep people in the workforce longer. That's has something to do with the people who are retiring out, living for 30 years in retirement, and it was quite a financial burden on themselves, leaving the workforce and having to survive decades on retirement. And so you see this active aging, keeping people in the workforce longer, and keeping people active in a variety of different sectors in terms of volunteering and otherwise. It's to facilitate a healthier lifestyle all around in both economic and from a social, personal standpoint for their aging population that's taking place in Europe. Sociocultural issues, migrants, refugees, and borders. The book discusses this influx of migrants that are coming. They're coming from the Middle East. This 2015-16 wave is coming from the conflict from Syria. Obviously, there's been a war in Syria that's been happening for quite a few years now. A lot of people, again, continually forget that that's happening. Again, we should keep that in mind. And we'll talk about it more once we get to Syria on our world tour. But that's had a profound impact for Europe, because you can see from a world map, there is a path for folks to literally walk from places like Syria into through Greece, through the Balkan Peninsula, and work their way up into Central and Western Europe. There are migrants that come from across the Mediterranean Sea, whether it be on rafts or some form of transportation, that come across from places like Libya and Algeria, Morocco. They come to places, former colonies perhaps, Italy, France, Spain. And some people are coming as guest workers, temporary workers that are coming to work in a particular industry. and you have other people that are coming. And so there's this difference between migrants and refugees is important. Some are coming from an economic standpoint, one for a better life. Those are considered to be more unworthy of acceptance in Europe rather than those that are asylum seekers seeking safety or haven from persecution or imminent death, like those that are from the Syrian conflict or the Syrian war right now. And so again, if you remember that Schengen Agreement, that free movement between countries has facilitated the movement of migrants to move around Europe at will. And so countries like Germany have taken upwards of 800,000 migrants themselves. So millions of migrants have come and moved across Europe. Mostly they're heading to places like Germany, countries that do have the means to support them. They're not typically staying in southeastern European countries. And so this idea, we're faced with alienation or acceptance. How do these Europeans accept or not, or do they alienate these migrants? And it is a mixed bag. Here you see protests, people of Muslim faith here protesting Islamophobia, seen here in French. This is happening in France because of what we saw was a hijab ban in France in order to preserve what they believed was their French identity. They made it illegal to wear hijabs in France in public places and things like that. It was wider in scope. It actually banned yarmulkes, Christian crosses, hijabs, and again in certain aspects. And so the Muslim people of Islam found it to be an attack on them, found them to be even further alienated than already to what they were. And again, this is an incident that's happening in France, and it's one that's quite complicated. It's gone to the courts, and it's happening over the course of several years. This isn't something that's quite new. And so that level of acceptance has varied to a large extent. I mean, these people often seem to look different, of course, based on the hijab, and that idea from a lot of Europeans is almost as if they've stigmatized them to an extent, or alienated them and left them to have to reside in areas that are just simply dominated by Muslims. These are people oftentimes, unless they have full acceptance of European culture, one that sort of dismisses their old ways of thinking and moving into European society as Europeans, this idea of, again, the strong feelings of their nationalism, then they don't typically accept them in a lot of cases, and the book does a good job explaining that. And you can sort of see that in societies today. Cities, suburbs of some of these cities, or even neighborhoods, often are cast to entire neighborhoods, entire Muslim or Islamic neighborhoods, because of that segregation, if you will, that takes place because of access to work and unemployment and affordable housing and things like that. So which brings us to terrorism in Europe. And by no means, I shouldn't even have to say it, really, but I should say it because I would be remiss if I didn't. Obviously, a small minority of people that have come fleeing crisis or coming for the betterment of themselves or their family, are coming for totally the right reasons. Unfortunately, what we've experienced, like in other situations around the world, some terrorists disguise themselves through those particular movements and perhaps find their ways into societies, piggybacking off of things like this refugee influx. And so this isn't something that's happened just since 2015 and 2016. I include this image of it's St. John's in Molenbeek. It's a neighborhood in Brussels, Belgium. Again, I said Brussels, Belgium. Fascinating city, hustle and bustle, capital of Europe because of the EU and NATO and everything that's happening there. But what you see is an area of very high unemployment and an area of disenfranchisement and alienation, and you have an overwhelming Muslim population there, and it has led, in some cases, to Islamic jihadism, which is that personal or group struggle to promote Islamic ideas through the threat or actual use of violence. And this area, St. John's Molenbeek in Belgium, has been traced of importance, and I mention it because Muslim terrorists from Molenbeek have had their influence in the 2004 Madrid bombings, 2014 incident in a museum in terms of killings, the 2015 Paris attacks, and the 2016 attacks on the metro station in Brussels. So this is a terror cell. Terror cells exist all over the world. They exist in the United States and in Europe, and obviously in the Middle East. That's where we most usually associate them with. But they are happening in Europe as well. And again, happening from a variety of reasons. That alienation from the European people can of course be a culprit to this radicalization process. A lot of these people have been in fact born here in Belgium or in France and things, and have this radicalization process that takes place because of no opportunity or this inclination to their jihadism that's happening in their communities. So terrorism is occurring in small isolated incidents in Europe, obviously at a very small scale, but to some extent has been active in the last few decades. And up next is the subregions, and so that takes us into our last section of Europe in Chapter 4.